The tension in the courtroom was almost unbearable. The air was thick with the weight of impending conflict, the kind that doesn't just simmer, but boils over into something explosive. Caroline Levit, an attorney with an unshakable reputation, stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she faced the man who had turned the justice system into his personal empire, Judge Samuel Reynolds. The room was silent, except for the distant sound of shuffling papers and the occasional creak of wooden benches. But everyone present could feel the undercurrent of battle brewing. This isn't a courtroom. It's a circus. And you, Judge Reynolds, are the master of deception, Caroline declared, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a firm resolve that echoed in every syllable she uttered. Reynolds barely reacted at first, lazily turning a page on the desk before him, as if her words were nothing more than an amusing distraction. Slow smirk spread across his face, the kind that exuded both arrogance and absolute authority. Finally, he met her gaze, his eyes cold and calculated. Ms. Levitt, your audacity is almost commendable. Almost. But what truly amuses me is your blind faith in the Constitution, as if it were some divine shield. Tell me, do you really think it will protect you in my courtroom? Caroline took a step forward, her hands clenched at her sides. I believe in the rule of law, Judge Reynolds. You should try it sometime, instead of twisting it to serve your own interests. Her words were sharp, deliberate. There was no room for pleasantries here. Reynolds let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if she were nothing more than a naive idealist. Ah, so now you see yourself as a warrior of justice? A martyr, perhaps? How convenient and how utterly predictable. His voice dripped with condescension, but Caroline wasn't fazed. I'm not a martyr, Your Honor. I'm not looking to be anyone's hero, she shot back. I'm simply someone who refuses to bow down to tyrants. His expression darkened slightly, though he quickly masked it with another smirk. Tyrant? No, Ms. Levitt. I am the law in this courtroom. And you? He leaned forward ever so slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Are nothing but a desperate woman trying to turn her trial into a political spectacle. Caroline tilted her head, her lips curling in a knowing smirk. A spectacle? That's interesting coming from a man who silences witnesses, buries evidence, and bends the law at will. Shall we talk about your track record, Judge? For the first time, Reynolds' fingers, which had been tapping rhythmically on the armrest of his chair, stopped moving. A flicker of irritation passed over his face, gone in an instant. Careful, Levitt, he warned, his voice like a low growl. There's a fine line between courage and recklessness, and you're about to cross it. Caroline's eyes gleamed with defiance. Is that a threat? Because I expected more from you? I thought I was dealing with a judge, not a petty tyrant with a bruised ego. The room was frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. A few reporters exchanged glances, sensing that something monumental was unfolding before them. Reynolds leaned back, his smirk returning, though there was a coldness in his eyes now. I don't make threats, Ms. Levitt. I issue rulings, and I could very well decide yours right here, right now. A slow smile crept across Caroline's face, her confidence unwavering. Let's see how long you can keep up that act, Your Honor. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The kind that signals something is about to snap. The kind that makes people lean in, breath held, waiting for the inevitable explosion. And in that moment, it was clear. This was no longer just a legal dispute. This was war. The atmosphere inside the courtroom had shifted from tense to electrified, as if the very walls were pulsing with the weight of what was unfolding. Caroline Levit stood unmoved, unwavering, her presence commanding despite the intimidation tactics being hurled at her from the judge's bench. She had faced difficult cases before, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about exposing something far larger, something rotten, something that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. And Samuel Reynolds? He wasn't just another corrupt official. He was a man who had built his throne on the bones of those who had dared to challenge him. From his seat, Reynolds exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the wooden gavel. It was a small movement, but to those who had observed him long enough, it was telling. He was losing his patience. "Tell me, Ms. Levitt," he drawled, his voice carrying an air of detached amusement. "Do you truly believe that standing there and slinging accusations at me will change anything? You are in my courtroom, facing charges of obstruction of justice, and yet instead of presenting a defense, you choose to grandstand. Curious, almost as if you have nothing of substance to argue." Caroline's lips pressed together for a moment before she responded, but when she did, her voice was razor-sharp. "Obstruction of justice," she repeated, almost tasting the words. What a convenient charge. What an easy label to slap onto someone who refuses to be bullied into silence. But let's be honest, Your Honor. Justice isn't what you're after. It never was. This entire proceeding is a joke, a performance orchestrated by a man desperate to cling to power. Reynolds let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if she were some misguided fool. Desperate? My dear, I don't need to be desperate. I am power. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his piercing gaze locked onto hers. And you? You are nothing but an unfortunate inconvenience, a footnote in a very long book filled with individuals who thought they could challenge me. The arrogance in his voice sent a ripple of murmurs through the audience. The reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scraping against their notepads as they documented every single exchange. But Caroline was unfazed. She had been waiting for this moment, for this very admission. "If that's true," she said slowly, tilting her head as if considering his words, "if you really are as untouchable as you claim, then why are you so bothered by me? Why feel the need to silence me at all?" Reynolds' expression darkened just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Because," he said smoothly, "there's a difference between an annoyance and a threat. And I do not tolerate threats." Caroline allowed herself a small smirk, stepping toward the defendant's table, letting her hands rest on the polished wood. "A threat? Interesting choice of words. Because from where I'm standing, it's you who seems threatened. You had no reason to bring these charges against me. You had no real case, yet here we are. So tell me, Judge Reynolds, what is it that you're so afraid of?" A murmur ran through the room, the tension building with each second that passed. Reynolds' jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before he forced himself to relax. He gestured vaguely with one hand as if dismissing her entirely. "Afraid? Of you?" He scoffed. "Please, you give yourself far too much credit, Ms. Levitt. Your ego is showing." "My ego?" Caroline let out a short, humorless laugh. "No. That would be your problem, wouldn't it? That's why you're sitting up there playing God with people's lives, thinking that robe makes you untouchable. But let's take a look at the facts, shall we?" She turned slightly, addressing not just Reynolds but the entire room. In the last 5 years alone, Judge Reynolds has presided over cases involving high-profile individuals accused of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. And do you know what those cases all have in common? Not a single conviction. Not one. She turned back to Reynolds, her eyes locking onto his. "That's quite the coincidence, wouldn't you say?" Reynolds' smirk faltered ever so slightly. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Caroline caught it. She pressed forward. "Let's take it further," she continued, pacing slightly. "In every one of those cases, the prosecution had strong evidence. Eyewitness testimony, paper trails, recordings. And yet in every single instance, those cases were thrown out, suppressed, dismissed on technicalities. And the man responsible? The one common denominator? You, Your Honor." The room erupted in whispers. The journalists leaned forward, their pens dancing over their notebooks. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably by the door, as if suddenly aware of the storm that was brewing. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with exaggerated exasperation. "Are you quite finished?" he asked, his voice tinged with boredom. "Because if I wanted a monologue, I'd turn on a courtroom drama. This is reality, Ms. Levitt. And in reality, you are the one on trial here." Not me. Caroline's smirk grew wider. You're right. This is reality. And in reality, people are watching, listening, questioning. You can try to brush this off, but the truth is already out there, Judge. And you can't control the narrative forever. For the first time, something flickered behind Reynolds' eyes. It wasn't anger, it wasn't amusement, it was something else, something deeper. Recognition. A dawning realization that this was slipping from his grasp. Before he could speak, Caroline delivered the final blow of the moment. You see, Your Honor, the thing about corruption is that it doesn't just exist. It leaves traces, patterns. And I've spent the last 6 months gathering those patterns. Every case you buried, every decision you manipulated, every time you let criminals walk free. And the best part? She let the silence hang for just a moment. I'm not the only one who knows. The entire courtroom went still. Even the reporters, who had been furiously taking notes, paused, their eyes flicking between Caroline and Reynolds. Reynolds' smirk was gone now. In its place was something else entirely, and for the first time since the trial began, Caroline saw it. A crack in the armor. The game had changed, and they both knew it. A suffocating stillness gripped the courtroom. The walls, once indifferent, witnesses to decades of judicial proceedings, now seemed to lean in, eager to absorb every syllable of the battle unfolding within them. The weight of Caroline's words still lingered in the air, hanging over the room like an approaching storm. For the first time in his long, untouchable career, Judge Samuel Reynolds didn't hold all the cards. And he knew it. From his elevated seat, he exhaled slowly, calculating. A lesser man might have reacted with rage, might have let his emotions betray him, but Reynolds was too practiced for that. He had ruled over this courtroom for years, sculpting his own version of justice with a precision that left no room for error. And now a single woman dared to unravel it all? No, not here, not now. Leaning back into his chair, he folded his hands before him, his voice measured, his tone deliberately slow. Ms. Levitt, he began, each syllable laced with condescension. It's truly remarkable, the lengths to which desperate people will go when they realize they have nothing left. Wild accusations, baseless theories, theatrics designed to distract from their own failings. He paused, allowing the words to settle. But let's be clear. Your opinion of my judicial history is as irrelevant as it is misguided. The only thing that matters in this courtroom is the law, and in accordance with that law, you are the one standing trial here, not me. Caroline let his words linger, absorbing their intent, but she did not waver. If anything, she seemed amused. Is that so? She murmured, tilting her head slightly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you're the one on the defensive. The corner of Reynolds' mouth twitched, a minuscule flicker of irritation, but his mask remained firmly in place. Confidence is an admirable trait, Ms. Levitt, he replied, his tone sharpening. Delusion, less so. Caroline took a step forward, her presence unwavering. You know, Judge, I've spent the last few years in and out of courtrooms, fighting for people who had their voices stolen by corrupt systems. People crushed under the weight of power wielded by men who think they can rewrite the law as they see fit, and every single time I've seen the same thing. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. The guilty ones always think they can talk their way out of it. They think if they act untouchable for long enough, people will stop questioning them. But here's the thing about corruption. It leaves footprints, and yours are all over this courtroom. A low murmur rippled through the audience, shifting like an undercurrent beneath the tension. Reynolds narrowed his eyes, his patience wearing thin. Enough, he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had wielded so effortlessly for years. I will not entertain your pathetic attempt at turning this trial into a spectacle. Your grandstanding is irrelevant, Ms. Levitt. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You obstructed justice. You interfered with an ongoing investigation. Caroline cut him off before he could finish. I exposed injustice. That's my real crime, isn't it? Reynolds' nostrils flared ever so slightly, the first real crack in his carefully curated composure. "Your arrogance is astounding." "My awareness is astounding," she corrected, her voice unwavering. "And that's what terrifies you. You built this courtroom into your own personal empire, Your Honor. A place where justice is nothing more than a prop in your performance. But the problem with ruling through fear is that eventually, people stop being afraid." Reynolds slammed his gavel against the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the chamber. "Ms. Levitt, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. Is that your last offense?" She shot back, stepping closer, her voice unwavering. "Threats? That's all you have left?" Reynolds' fingers tightened around the gavel. "You're out of line. You've been out of line for years," she retorted, her words striking with the force of a hammer. "But here's the thing about people like you. You think as long as you sit up there above everyone else, you're untouchable. You think that robe gives you immunity. But power is fragile, Your Honor. It only lasts as long as people allow it to." Silence stretched across the room, thick and unrelenting. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating. Even the bailiff standing rigid near the judge's bench looked uncertain. The court reporter's fingers had stopped typing. The journalists, previously scribbling furiously, now watched with wide eyes, their pens hovering above their notepads. Reynolds, however, was not a man who accepted defeat. Not easily, not without a fight, and so he did what men like him always did. He twisted the truth. A slow, calculating smirk crept back onto his face as he straightened his posture, adjusting his robe with deliberate ease. "You know what I find truly fascinating, Ms. Levitt?" His voice was smooth, his confidence creeping back with every syllable. "People like you always claim to stand for justice, yet when confronted with the actual law, you flail, you panic, you deflect." He leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing. "Tell me, if you're so confident in your righteousness, then why are you the one on trial? Why is it that you are the one facing a conviction?" Caroline didn't blink. "Because that's how corruption works. It buries the truth beneath a mountain of lies. It turns the innocent into criminals and the criminals into kings." Reynolds let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, the classic conspiracy. Convenient, isn't it?" He gestured vaguely toward the room. "A room filled with people, a public trial, a jury, and yet, according to you, all of this is an illusion?" His smirk widened. "Tell me, Ms. Levitt, do you honestly believe that everyone here is blind to reality? That only you hold the truth?" Caroline met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No," she said simply. "I believe the truth speaks for itself, and right now it's speaking louder than you are." Reynolds' smirk faltered. Just for a second, and that was all Caroline needed. She turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward the jury. "I know how this works," she continued. "I know the way power manipulates, the way it distorts reality until people doubt what they know to be true. But deep down, you know what's happening here. You can feel it. The way the weight of this moment has shifted." Her words hung in the air like a silent reckoning. And suddenly, Reynolds saw it. The shift. The subtle but undeniable change in the way the jury was looking at him. The hesitation, the doubt. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. Caroline had planted the seed, and no matter how deeply he tried to bury it, it was already growing. His grip on power was slipping, and for the first time, he had no idea how to stop it. The courtroom had transformed into an arena, a battleground where words were as sharp as blades and silence was more deafening than any outburst. The tension, stretched to its absolute limit, now teetered on the edge of something explosive. Caroline Levit stood her ground, her expression unflinching, unwavering as Judge Samuel Reynolds clung desperately to the last vestiges of control. The realization was settling in, slowly, painfully, for a man who had spent his entire career believing himself untouchable. He could feel it in the shifting gazes, in the wary eyes of the jury, in the way the reporters seemed to write faster, as if documenting his downfall in real time. His power was slipping, crumbling beneath the weight of his own corruption, and there was only one person to blame for that. his fingers curled into a tight fist atop his bench. The arrogance, the smug detachment he had worn like armor was beginning to crack, revealing the raw, festering anger beneath. And when he spoke again, it wasn't in the carefully measured cadence of a judge presiding over his courtroom. No, this was something different, something ugly. "You're nothing but a bitch for Trump," Reynolds spat, his voice dripping with venom. The words reverberated through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps rippled across the audience. The jury stiffened, and the court reporter hesitated for the first time since the proceedings began. The insult was crude, unrestrained, so far beneath the decorum expected in a court of law that for a split second, the entire room seemed frozen in disbelief. But Caroline? She didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. She didn't even blink. Instead, a slow, knowing smile crept across her lips. "And that," she murmured, her voice smooth, deliberate, dripping with quiet triumph, "is the moment you lost." Reynolds' nostrils flared, his jaw tightening. But Caroline had already turned toward the jury, her hands resting lightly on the defense table. "Did you hear that?" she asked, not raising her voice but making sure every single person in the room felt the weight of her words. Not an argument, not a refutation, not a shred of legal reasoning, just rage, just insults. Her gaze swept over the jury members, watching as realization began to dawn on them, the pieces clicking together in their minds. This isn't about the law. This never was. This is about power, about control, about a man so used to getting his way that the second someone challenges him, the mask slips. She turned back to Reynolds, watching as his fingers drummed against the desk, a nervous tick he had never once exhibited in all his years on the bench. "You just proved everything I've been saying, Your Honor," she said softly, the irony thick in her tone. "Because when a man like you runs out of manipulation, out of intimidation, out of corruption to hide behind, do you know what's left?" She let the silence linger, then delivered the answer like a final blow. Fear. The jury was no longer just listening to her. They were seeing it. The cracks in Reynolds' composure, the unraveling of his once absolute control. The mask of invulnerability had been shattered, and what lay beneath was not the untouchable judge he had spent years pretending to be, but a desperate man grasping at whatever scraps of authority remained. A voice from the gallery broke through the silence. "Disgraceful. Another. Unbelievable." A murmur of discontent spread, rippling through the spectators like a wildfire. Even the bailiff, the very enforcer of Reynolds' courtroom, shifted uneasily. The tide had turned. Reynolds slammed his gavel down furiously, his voice laced with panic beneath the bravado. "Silence!" he barked. "This is my courtroom, and I will not tolerate—" But his voice was drowned out by the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps. From the back of the courtroom, a group of officials entered, their presence commanding immediate attention. The insignia on their jackets made it clear. They were from the Judicial Review Board. The murmurs turned into hushed whispers. The journalists snapped to attention, cameras raised, pens poised. Reynolds paled. One of the officials, a man with sharp features and a grim expression, stepped forward, a thick folder tucked beneath his arm. "Judge Reynolds," he said, his voice even, formal. "We need to speak with you. Immediately." The gavel slipped slightly in Reynolds' grip. He opened his mouth to protest, to fight, but for the first time in his entire career there was no defense to be made. No power left to wield, no law he could twist in his favor. The room held its breath as he slowly rose from his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a coffin lid. His once absolute rule over this courtroom was over, and standing across from him, unshaken, undefeated, Caroline Levit simply watched. Watched as justice, real justice, finally began to take shape. Watched as the walls of corruption he had built started to crumble. Watched as the man who had tried to destroy her was led away, his downfall unfolding in front of the very people he had once ruled over with an iron fist. And when it was over, when the door shut behind him, sealing his fate, she exhaled, slow and steady, before turning to face the audience. She wasn't smiling. Not yet, but she would be, because the fight was far from over. But the war, it had just begun.